The cheapest and most convenient way to improve your speaking ability in Chinese is to speak to yourself. Beyond being easy and free, speaking to yourself is more beneficial than you might think. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about speaking to yourself as a way of improving your speaking ability in Chinese. And this might sound stupid, but I'm quite serious. This method has some merits and it's also free and very convenient. Before I go into more details though, I'd like to mention that my pronunciation course is open for registration and that it will remain open until the end of Friday this week, and that's September 22nd. Should you listen to this episode later, you can still head over to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com for more information about the course, and you will also be able to sign up for a waiting list. What I'm going to talk about in this week's episode is not a substitute for other methods of practicing speaking in Chinese, for example, practicing your pronunciation by taking my course, but it is a complement and something that you can use if you don't want to or if it's not practical to practice speaking in other more conventional ways. To understand why speaking to yourself in Chinese can actually be useful, we need to talk a little bit about what's needed to speak fluently in Chinese or in any other language. When we want to speak, there are many things that need to come together and they need to do so very smoothly for this to be at all fluent. For example, if we are in a conversation, we need to figure out what to say, what is appropriate to say, what do I want to say. And then we need to figure out which words to use in Chinese, and we need to retrieve those words from memory, provided of course that we have learned them. And then we also need to recall what we know about Chinese word order and grammar, and piece these words together into a sentence that makes sense in Chinese. Finally, we also need to deliver the sentence. We need to pronounce it in a way that the listener can understand. And this is an area where this method, speaking with yourself, doesn't really work all that well, but fortunately we have the pronunciation course I just mentioned if you want to focus on your pronunciation, or you can use the method I discussed in last week's episode 162, when we talked about mimicking native speakers. Anyway, in order to speak Chinese, we need to be able to do all these things, and if we want to speak Chinese fluently, this needs to be more or less effortless. We cannot stop and think about each step. Oh, what do I want to say here? Which words are appropriate? Is this the right word? Wait a second, how does this word fit with this other word? And which tone is it supposed to be? And so on. If you do that, you will maybe be able to say something, but it will be way too slow to meet anybody's definition of fluent. Speaking of the F word, if you want to be fluent in Chinese, it's much more important to be very good at the basics of the language and the things that you do know. It is not essential that you know all the words and all the grammar, but you do need to be able to use what you do know very quickly and effortlessly. And that is something that speaking to yourself can help with. Before I discuss that though, I'd like to zoom out a little bit and talk about building speaking proficiency in general. If you read online or ask around, you will find that there are different camps when it comes to how to build speaking proficiency. So some people will say that listening is key, so input is king, and the more you listen the better, and then sooner or later you will be able to speak as well. Other people say that you should start speaking from day one and take every single opportunity you can to speak the language, and this will be much faster than simply listening. This is not the time and place to discuss this question in detail, but I do think that both camps have a point and they do approach the question from somewhat different angles. Generally speaking, the claim that input is king has much more scientific backing, and when you think about it, it's kind of obvious that you have to listen a lot in order to be able to speak. Because where else are you going to hear these words in context? Where are you going to learn the words, how they are used, how they are pronounced, and so on? So in this sense, speaking ability is the tip of the iceberg that sticks up out of the water, but you also have this huge amount of input that has to have taken place for that piece to actually stick out. If you think about it, it's a little bit weird to expect that you will learn new things by speaking, because of course you can only use what you have already learned when you speak, and so that kind of requires you to have done something other than speaking to pick these things up, otherwise you wouldn't be able to say them. Naturally, if you have a conversation, you're doing both speaking and listening, so you can argue that this is then more useful, but then again, you can then say that the listening part of the conversation is where you actually learn new things, and in the speaking part, you only get better at the things you have already learned. On the other hand, I think that the advice to speak from day one is well meant, and it usually works for people who have been through formal education, because there isn't enough of communicative practice in formal education. So if you've studied French or Spanish or some other foreign language for years and years in school, and you simply can't use it, that's probably because you've never had much practice to communicate in the language. And if you're coming from that background, then speaking more and speaking immediately and making sure that your practice is communicative will be very helpful. If you want a more in-depth discussion, I wrote an article titled "Is Speaking More Important Than Listening When Learning Chinese?" And the answer is, as you might have guessed by now, yes. But if you want to read the article, I'll put a link to it in the description. Okay, so listening or input in general is extremely important for building speaking ability or output in general, but this does not mean that speaking is unnecessary or not helpful. As I mentioned earlier, there are many things that need to come together very smoothly for speaking to be possible at all, and practicing your speaking can speed up this process significantly. As a teacher, this is very easy to see because I often ask students questions that I know that they know the answer to, and I know that they have enough Chinese to answer this question in Chinese. But still, the first time you ask the question, they will take a long time to answer. They need to think about which words to use to retrieve them from memory and think about how do I say this, how do I pronounce this tone, and so on. But then eventually they'll get it. And if you ask this question a lot, let's say it's a question about time, or when we shall have class next time, or things like that that involve dates and numbers and times and so on, their speech becomes very fluent after practicing this again and again. This is not because they have learned new words or new grammar, or indeed they haven't learned anything new at all. They've simply become faster at retrieving and piecing together these words to form the sentences they need to communicate. More advanced students can probably relate to the same thing when it comes to big numbers. So most of us learned how to say 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 and so on in Chinese probably during our first semester, maybe even the first month, because it isn't that hard on paper. However, actually mastering large numbers in Chinese so you can say them quickly and effortlessly clearly isn't easy. I've studied Chinese for more than 15 years, and I still need to think about how to say some large numbers sometimes. And for anyone new to Chinese, the problem is that in Chinese we change words after every fourth zero, whereas in English we do so after every third. That means that in English we have 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, but we're still counting thousands. And then when we get to 1,000,000, we don't say that, we say a million. And then we can add 3 more zeros and we get to a billion and so on. Chinese does not work like this. Instead, we have a specific word for 10,000, which is 1. And then if we want to say 100,000, we don't say 100,000, we say 10,000 or 10,000. And then if you want to say a million, we don't have a new word. Instead, we say 100,000. So 110,000 in other words. And then for 10 million, we don't say 10 and then a word for million. Instead, we say 1,000,000. So that would be 1,000, 10,000. So that would be 10 million if you count it out. But we don't think like that in English, and this takes a long time to get good at. If you interact with many Chinese speakers in English, you might have noticed that they sometimes get frustrated by large numbers and they kind of have to calculate or look at the numbers and actually count the number of zeros before the number makes sense to them. And this is nothing to scoff at or laugh at all. When I deal with large numbers in Chinese, sometimes I also need to think twice before knowing the answer. I think the only way to get really good at large numbers is to work with something where you have to use these numbers and that they mean something. Because normally when you just say a large number, it's just, well, a large number. But if you say want to buy something, it kind of matters if it's 10 million or 100 million, and then you really need to listen and parse these numbers and convert them. I wrote an article about this many years ago about why counting in Chinese is actually much harder than you think, and it's not just the large numbers, it includes the smaller numbers too, and I'll put a link to that article in the description. The reason I bring it up here, though, is that it should be very obvious when it comes to numbers that you know what you need to know. It is not about being able to retrieve these words or knowing the words in the first place. It's about being able to do so quickly. To circle back to what we're actually talking about here, I mentioned this as an example of something where more practice actually makes you much more fluent and where simply knowing something isn't enough. And as we shall see, this is a very good example also of when speaking to yourself can be quite useful. If you think about it, I already said above that speaking with other people usually doesn't teach you that much, at least not the speaking part. And if you at least partly accept that argument, that means also that if you remove the other person, you can still practice speaking and get many of the benefits, even if no one hears what you are saying. Actually, you can reap some of the benefits without speaking at all, and you simply think in Chinese to yourself, or you sub-vocalize, so you think about the words, you say the sentences in your head, as it were. There is actually a lot of research when it comes to verbalization or talking to yourself while solving complex problems, for example. And if you want the references here, you can head over to the written article on Hacking Chinese. But what I want to highlight here is that it's not the speaking itself that makes this useful for, say, problem solving, but the cognitive processes that lead up to speaking aloud. It's not the utterance of the words themselves, but what you need to do, what your brain needs to do to bring you to that point. And many of those benefits will apply even if you don't actually pronounce the words aloud. I promoted speaking with yourself as the cheapest and most convenient way of practicing your speaking ability in Chinese, and it's of course very convenient. You always have yourself, and if you don't even need to speak aloud, then you can also do this in public, because of course it's a little bit weird if you speak to yourself on the bus, and I'll give some examples of this later. And of course it's also completely free. Okay, so let's assume that I have at least partly convinced you that speaking to yourself can be useful. The next question is how to do this and what to say. You can of course talk about anything, but here are some examples that I've tried and that I find particularly useful. The first is to narrate what you are doing or what is happening around you. And this is something you can do on different levels. So if you're a beginner, you can, for example, try to name things that you see, or maybe, for example, you can play a little game with yourself where you have to name everything you touch in Chinese before you touch it. And then you check out your morning routine. How far can you get before you have to touch something you don't need a name for in Chinese? You look that up, and the next day you get one word further into your routine, or something like that. If you've come a little bit further in Chinese, you can describe what you are doing to yourself as you do it, or you can describe what someone else is doing, or what things around you look like, or objects in your vicinity, and things like that. I've written an article about this already, and I'll put a link in the description. It's called Vocalize More to Learn More Chinese. Next, you can comment on things as they happen. Imagine that you're a commentator, or that you have opinions about how what people do, or what you do, or what happens. You can also solve problems and make choices in a very deliberate way. So you spell things out, of course, in Chinese. You argue the points, you say why A is better than B, then you flip it around and say where B is better than A, and so on. There are studies that show that if you do this in a second language, you might think more logically than if you do it in your native language. But we also have the effect that cognitive strain, i.e. when something is taxing and demanding, makes you think more logically and objectively, and so speaking in a foreign language certainly counts, and that then contributes to this ability. Again, for some references and further reading, check the written article on Hacking Chinese. Next up, you can invent or imagine dialogues. This could be between imaginary people or between you and someone else. For example, imagine that you're going to go to a job interview. You probably will run through the questions in your head in your native language, if this is in your native language, and you can do similar things in Chinese. Not just about job interviews, of course, but any kind of situation you might find yourself in. Another activity I already mentioned briefly earlier is that you can play word games with yourself, and again I'll put links to the description to an article where I describe this in more detail, but there are many games where you describe words without being able to say them. So you might explain a tree by saying that it's a tall thing outside that grows, or something like that. And then doing this in Chinese is awesome for practicing fluency, because not being allowed to say the word is basically the same as not knowing the word, and so this is a perfect practice for navigating around vocabulary that you don't know. While this game is of course much more fun to play with other people, you can get some of the benefits by playing it on your own. Finally, I'd like to mention counting again, and we talked about it already, so I'll keep it brief. But as a beginner, you can start counting everything in Chinese. Maybe the number of push-ups you do in the gym, or the number of eggs you add to your omelette, or whatever it is, count in Chinese. Okay, now that we have looked at how to speak to yourself and what to say, let's move on to some other ways of practicing, because of course there are downsides with speaking with yourself. This should be rather obvious though. I mean, you don't get any feedback, you don't practice communicative strategies, it gets a bit boring or weird and so on. I'm not going to go into all the details here because I think you can think of these as easily as I can. However, I want to mention some other ways you can practice speaking on your own before we round off this episode, and I've mentioned 2 of these already. So the first one is to mimic native speakers. This is something you can do largely on your own, although I do recommend that you get feedback occasionally, but most of the time is still spent on your own without anybody else, and it can still be hugely beneficial for your pronunciation and your speaking ability in general. Second, recording yourself when you're speaking Chinese, and this might be when you are speaking to yourself or when you're speaking with other people, when you have a presentation, a conversation, or anything you fancy. And just listening back to your own Chinese can be immensely helpful because you will hear lots of things you did not hear while you were speaking, because your brain was fully occupied with all the fancy stuff we've talked about in this episode, and you did not have time to monitor everything you said. But if you listen to yourself afterwards, you will be able to spot many things that you can improve. Finally, I want to shamelessly promote my own pronunciation course. It is not free, and even if it is convenient to access, working with pronunciation, especially if you've been learning Chinese for a while and look to polish or fix mistakes that you have, is not very convenient. It requires effort and commitment. But if you want to do that, and you want my guidance for how to improve and information about the sounds and tones of Mandarin, then do head over to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.